I tell you a true crime story and we drink. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you choose to enjoy one of our themed margaritas, please ensure that you are of legal drinking age and have fun but drink responsibly. The first usage of the term Deeznutz comes from Chronic, a 1992 Dr. Dre album. The song begins with a phone call between a man and a woman. After they go back and forth for a little while, the man suddenly shouts, "Deeznutz!" This sets the tone of the term being used in an intentionally disruptive way. By 1993, Deeznutz had been used in several titles of other songs by rap and R&B groups. The phrase reached new heights of popularity via Instagram in 2015 when a video of someone telling Deeznutz jokes to a friend over the phone went viral. Later that year, Deeznutz found themselves a U.S. presidential candidate, scoring third in public polls, right after Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Turns out 15-year-old Brady Olson had registered as a candidate using that pseudonym, saying he was frustrated with both of the two mainstream political parties. The use of the phrase has been pretty ubiquitous ever since, both as a way to interrupt a conversation and as a series of rather uncouth jokes. And it turns out, Deeznutz was a clever thing to name a squirrel. I mean, it kind of is. Now, it's important for me, for no reason at all, to tell you that this particular squirrel's name was spelled Deeznutz. One word, two Z's. Deeznutz. Okay, let's remember that for today's margarita, y'all needed to do some prep work. In case you didn't, get out of here and go chop some pecans and add those plus maple syrup to taste to a tequila, cheap one, of your choice. I'll see you back here in a few days once it's had time to infuse in the tequila and we will finish up the drink. Okay, welcome back. So for this margarita, we're going to use 2 parts of our infused tequila. We'll mix that with 1 part lime juice, 1 part triple sec, and 1 part simple syrup. We'll shake her up and strain over fresh ice with a salt-rimmed glass. Okay, let's get to the meat of the episode, shall we? Squirrels are indigenous to the Americas, Eurasia, and Africa. The word squirrel was taken from the ancient Greek skiros, which means shadow-tailed. They are named for their big bushy tails. Squirrels are generally small animals and typically have slender bodies with very long, very bushy tails and big ol' eyes. In general, their fur is soft and silky. In most squirrel species, the hind limbs are longer than the forelimbs, and their paws have claws made for grasping and climbing. Tree squirrels are one of the few mammals, actually, that can descend a tree head first. They rotate their little ankles 180 degrees, which allows their hind paws to point backward and grip the tree bark from the opposite direction. Squirrels live in almost every habitat. They are mostly herbivores, eating nuts and seeds. Many squirrels will also eat insects. Alabama resident Mickey Polk was no stranger to the inside of a jail cell. Before his brief brush with fame, he had been booked into jail more than 24 times in his first 35 years of life for a variety of charges. In June of 2019, the Limestone County Sheriff's Office announced that their deputies had received tips that Mickey had what the tipster deemed as an, quote, attack squirrel, end quote, which he allegedly fed methamphetamine to keep aggressive. When deputies searched a home on Piney Chapel Road, they say they found, in addition to meth, drug paraphernalia, body armor, and ammunition. They also happened upon the 10-month-old squirrel in a cage, whose name was, as we said before, Deeznutz. One word, 2 Z's. Among a lot of those things being not legal for Mickey to have, it's also illegal to own a squirrel in the state of Alabama. Mickey wasn't home when it happened, but deputies arrested his friend, Ronnie. Deputy Stephen Young told newspaper reporters that evidently there have not been effective drug testing kits developed for squirrels, so there wasn't a real way for them to tell if the squirrel was high on meth. The department consulted with an official from Alabama Game and Fish, and upon their advice, released the squirrel outside. Evidently, since the little bushy guy seemed healthy and wasn't emaciated, that was the best move. After officials executed the warrant, Mickey returned to the house, which he insisted he wasn't even living in anymore, but was in the process of moving. and he heard a screaming sound coming from a tree about 50 to 60 feet away. Deeznutz, up in a tree, upset and scared. He whistled, and Deeznutz quickly jumped down onto Mickey's shoulder, and he was, naturally, irate that they had let his baby go. He had been taking care of the squirrel since it was born and fed it out of a baby bottle. According to Mickey, the squirrel had no chance of making it out in the wild, as he'd never really even lived in the wild. When Mickey was working a job cutting trees, the little baby squirrel had fallen out of a tree. For the next 6 weeks, he woke up every 2 hours to feed him formula and make sure that the heating pad was working. Eventually, he trained his new pet to use a litter box and sleep in a hammock. When the animal started having seizures, Mickey took him for veterinary care over the state line in Tennessee, and he followed the advice of the veterinarian. And what about the accusations of meth? Mickey did acknowledge that little Deeznutz was a, curse word warning, mean motherfucker, but rebuked any claims that he was drugging the squirrel. Mickey declared that it would be irresponsible for the police to release a meth-fueled squirrel into the wild to attack humans as evidence that the police didn't likely even believe the story that they told. And, in what is probably the most logical thing anyone said in this entire case, Mickey said, quote, "You can't give squirrels meth. It would kill them," end quote. But his logic in this instance did not lend itself to him, turning himself into authorities. There was a warrant out for his arrest on drug and weapons charges, but Mickey said the charges were bogus. He alleged that he wasn't even living in the house anymore and that he had a letter from his landlord attesting to that fact. He wasn't totally moved out because his roommate had a cat that he was afraid would scare the little bushy-tailed fella, Deeznutz. So that's why the squirrel was still at the old apartment. He said he was going back to take care of his little buddy daily. I'm not sure why authorities were to believe that he'd moved out all of his stuff except his squirrel, but definitely none of the drugs or weapons were his, but okay, whatever. Mickey did several phone interviews and filmed at least one Facebook video while he was on the lam, defending his little buddy. On a phone interview that he had with a local radio station, he assured the DJs that Deeznutz was doing well. He said, quote, "He's in his hammock right now, munching on a piece of celery," end quote. He was so protective of Deeznutz that he didn't even want people smoking around his beloved pet. When talking to the Washington Post, he said, quote, "My squirrel is babied beyond anything anyone can imagine. It has a very good life," end quote. Honestly, a hammock and munching on celery does seem pretty good. On June 27th, 2019, Mickey Polk's brief career as a fugitive ended. The arrest happened after narcotics investigators were surveilling a hotel in Killen, Alabama. He fled on a stolen motorcycle, which he is accused of evidently ramming into an investigator's vehicle. Mickey was booked into the Lauderdale County Jail on charges of attempting to elude, criminal mischief, receiving stolen property, and of being a felon in possession of a pistol. It appears after they apprehended him, they discovered he also had a .45 caliber handgun in his waistband. It seems that before the tiny, not dramatic at all motorcycle chase, Mickey, in a plan to eventually turn himself in, had rehomed Deeznutz the squirrel in Tennessee because he was worried that officials in Alabama may have decided to euthanize his squirrel. Or, I guess logically, return him to the wild again. He told news outlets, quote, "I do miss him. I usually let him sleep somewhere near my bed, but I do miss him hard," end quote. So what do you think? Have you ever thought about owning an exotic animal? Do you think that Mickey should have been allowed to keep his squirrel? Do you think he fed his squirrel meth? If so, what the heck? And why did authorities just let the squirrel go outside? Do you think that was the most responsible move for a potentially drug-addicted, rage-filled animal? Should they have pushed harder with the wildlife rescue to take little Deeznutz in? The ending of today's story is a bit of a mystery. It appears that at least one of the charges against Mickey Polk were dropped, though not the charge of possession of a wild animal. He still bonded out in February of 2020 after spending 8 months in jail. He did tell news reporters then, quote, "I still got him. He's good. I got a permit for him. He's up in Tennessee," end quote. But I don't know what happened with the little squirrel or if he's still alive. And though I found some public information about good old Mickey, for the sake of his privacy, I think I'll let y'all live in the mystery. I wish them both the best, but would advise that Mickey Polk no longer feed furry critters meth, if at one time he did decide that was a good idea. Thanks for hanging out with me. I know these mini mayhems have gotten some mixed reviews, but sometimes there's just a good story that must be told. Maybe someday when I'm doing Margs and Mayhem full time, I'll be able to add these as a fun Saturday feature or something. Next week, we're headed back to my home state of Kansas, where we will talk about one of my favorite figures in history, Carrie Nation. Carrie hated alcohol so much, she was willing to take things and hatchets into her own hands. And in honor of her, we're not having a margarita. Just kidding. We're removing all the frills and having tequila shots. Carrie would approve, I think. Actually, I'm pretty sure she wouldn't. Anyway, all you'll need for the next week is tequila, salt, and a lime. You can definitely have a lot of mayhem with just those few ingredients. Quick reminder that I always put the recipes for the margaritas in the description box for the episode, and I put the ingredients for the next week's margarita in as well. That way you can go shopping and be prepared to drink with me. And if you need more than a recipe and what I say over the podcast, I make the drinks weekly on the Tickety Talk Clock app. I'll see you next week, and remember, there are always alternatives to murder and drugging your pet squirrel with meth.